In August of 2025, a 38-year-old dermatologist in Scottsdale posted a photo from a rented 6,000 square foot house on Camelback Mountain. The caption said, "Blessed." 2 weeks later, court records showed she had filed for bankruptcy. Nobody who liked that photo ever saw the filing. Here's what most people believe. If everyone around you seems to be doing better financially, you must be falling behind. But the actual data tells a different story. Household income peaks in your late 40s, at a median of $116,800 a year. And yet nearly 1 in 4 American households earning over $100,000 a year is still living paycheck to paycheck. Doing well and looking wealthy have quietly become two separate things. So the real question isn't why they seem to have more than you. It's how much of what you're seeing is even real. That answer is going to surprise you. There's a mechanism behind this, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in every feed you scroll. Until you understand it, you'll keep measuring your very real progress against other people's very fake starting line. My name is Alex. If you've ever closed your phone feeling behind despite doing everything right, stick around because the math says otherwise. I'm going to show you how the illusion gets built and how the people quietly ahead of you actually behave. Once you understand the difference, you'll stop shrinking your own life to match someone else's highlight reel. That illusion works especially well on people exactly like you, in your 40s and 50s. And it starts with a number the algorithm never shows you. Why your feed isn't representative. Here's a strange fact. The average person now spends more time watching other people's money than thinking about their own. Let me tell you about a guy named Derek. Derek is a physical therapist in Scottsdale, Arizona. Last spring, he rented a Lamborghini Urus Performante for a weekend. It cost him about $1,500 a day. He drove it up Camelback Mountain, filmed himself pulling into a rented house with a view, and posted it with a caption about grinding and manifesting. 40,000 people saw that video. Maybe a few hundred of them wondered if it was rented. Almost none of them found out it was. That's not really a story about Derek. It's a story about what the algorithm is built to do. And once you understand that, the whole feeling of falling behind starts to look different. Here's the mechanism. Social platforms don't show you what's typical. They show you what performs. And extremes perform. A Lamborghini gets watched. A Honda Accord in a driveway does not. So the system isn't lying to you exactly, but it is only showing you the top sliver of outcomes and calling it a normal Tuesday. You're not seeing a representative sample of American life. You're seeing a highlight reel of the most photogenic 5% of it, playing on a loop. And here's where human nature makes it worse. We don't naturally compare ourselves downward. Nobody scrolls past someone struggling and feels better about their own situation. We compare upward, automatically, almost involuntarily. So you're not measuring yourself against the median. You're measuring yourself against the most extreme, most curated, most financially engineered version of a life that exists on the entire platform. Now let's actually look at where you stand, because the real numbers might surprise you. Household income peaks in your late 40s and early 50s, and it peaks higher than any other age group in the country. Median net worth for people in that bracket currently sits at around $246,000, and that number is 82% higher than people just 10 years younger. Read that again. You are, statistically, in the strongest financial bracket of your entire life. That's not motivational fluff. That's what the Federal Reserve's own household data shows. So if the numbers say you're doing fine, why does it feel like everyone else is doing so much better? Because feelings don't run on medians. Feelings run on whatever crossed your screen this morning. And this morning, it was probably somebody's rented Lamborghini, not somebody's retirement account. I want to be careful here, because this isn't about telling you to stop comparing yourself to others. That's easier said than done, and frankly, a little condescending coming from a video on the internet. This is about something more specific. It's about understanding that the comparison itself is rigged. You're not losing a fair race, you're watching a highlight reel and mistaking it for a scoreboard. And once you see that clearly, the anxiety starts to lose its grip a little. Not because your bank account changed, because you finally understand what you were actually looking at. But here's the uncomfortable part. Derek's rented Urus isn't even the interesting story. The interesting story is everything else people are renting, borrowing, and financing to build that same illusion, piece by piece, until it looks like a life. How luxury content gets manufactured. There's a service in Los Angeles where you can pay to sit inside a private jet that never leaves the tarmac. It's real. People book an hour inside a parked Gulfstream, take 40 minutes of photos and video, and post it like they just landed in Aspen. The plane isn't theirs. It isn't even flying. It's a prop, and it's rented by the hour, the same way you'd rent a photo studio. Once you know that trick exists, you start noticing how many of the props in your feed aren't actually owned by anyone in the video. Take Bree, a wedding photographer outside Nashville. Bree built a following showing off what looked like an enviable collection of designer pieces. Her most liked post was carrying a Hermes Birkin 30 in Togo leather, a bag that retails for around $12,000, if you can even get one, since Hermes doesn't just sell them to anyone who walks in with cash. What she didn't mention is that the bag came from a designer rental service. She paid about $200 for the week. Then she sent it back. Here's the pattern once you start looking for it. The Rolex Daytona on someone's wrist, retail price around $15,000, with a wait list that can run years. A lot of those aren't purchased. They're rented from watch subscription services, or borrowed for a single shoot, or bought secondhand at a steep markup that nobody mentions in the caption. The waterfront house in Naples, Florida, the one that looks like an 8-figure Port Royal estate. Often it's a short-term rental booked for a weekend, styled for content, and handed back to the property manager on Monday. None of this is illegal. None of it is even unusual anymore. It's become its own quiet industry, and I actually find that kind of fascinating, in a slightly grim way. There are entire businesses now built around renting the appearance of wealth to people who want to sell you something, usually a course, usually about how they got rich. Now, some of this luxury is real, and that's the part that matters more. A meaningful chunk of it is financed, not rented, and financed in a way that doesn't show up in a single Instagram caption. Buy now, pay later apps, and store credit cards have made it easier than ever to walk out with a $5,000 handbag while only feeling a fraction of the cost today. Retail store cards routinely carry interest rates near 30%. That's not a detail anyone puts in the caption either. So here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a second. If you had to guess right now, how much of the wealth you scroll past every single day is actually owned outright by the person showing it to you? I'd guess it's a lot less than it looks like. And I think some part of you already suspected that, even before you heard the specific numbers. This matters because it changes what you're actually comparing yourself to. You're not behind a person, you're behind a production. And productions get funded, staged, and returned by Monday morning. But here's where it gets more uncomfortable, because not everyone building this illusion is a stranger on your phone renting a jet for an hour. Some of them are people you actually know, making genuinely serious money, and somehow still broke by the 15th of every month. High income doesn't mean high savings. Here's a number that should not make sense, and yet it does. Nearly half of six-figure households in this country are one missed paycheck away from real trouble. Let me introduce you to Todd. Todd is an orthodontist outside Charlotte, North Carolina. He clears roughly $340,000 a year, which puts him well above what most people would consider made-it money. He drives a Mercedes-Benz leased at $879 a month with $6,500 down. He lives in a $1.4 million house in the Myers Park neighborhood, financed with an 80% loan. On paper, Todd looks like exactly the kind of person you'd feel behind compared to. Here's what Todd's Instagram doesn't show you. Some months covering the mortgage, the lease, the private school tuition, and the property taxes leaves almost nothing left over. Todd isn't lying about his life. He's just not showing you the spreadsheet underneath it. And Todd is not some rare outlier I found to make a point. Right now, close to 44% of households earning over $100,000 a year say they're living paycheck to paycheck. Read that again, because it's worth sitting with. These aren't people who are bad with money in some obvious way. These are dentists, engineers, sales directors, people who did everything the traditional path told them to do. And a huge share of them still feel like they're one bad month from a real problem. So how does that happen? How do you earn 3-4 times the national median and still feel like you're treading water? The honest answer is a pattern called lifestyle creep, and it's less about bad decisions and more about a kind of financial gravity that pulls on everyone at roughly the same rate. Here's how it actually works. Every time income goes up, spending quietly rises to meet it, usually before a single extra dollar makes it into savings. The raise arrives, and almost immediately, something absorbs it. A better car, a bigger house, a country club membership that felt reasonable given the new salary. It rarely feels like one big decision. That's what makes it so effective. It's 100 small upgrades that each feel justified in the moment. New job, so you deserve a nicer car payment. Bigger house, so now the old furniture looks wrong next to it. Nicer neighborhood, so suddenly eating at home feels a little embarrassing when everyone else is doing dinner at the new steakhouse downtown. None of these decisions feels reckless individually. Stacked together, they quietly consume the entire raise, and sometimes more than the raise. And here's the part that I think is genuinely worth pausing on. This isn't really a story about weak willpower. It's a story about incentives. The mortgage lender, the leasing company, the credit card issuer, they all make more money the more of your income they can capture. Nobody in that chain benefits from Todd investing his raise instead of leasing a new SUV with it. So the whole system nudges gently, constantly towards spending it, dressed up as normal, reasonable, deserved. Which brings up an important question. If income alone doesn't explain who ends up ahead financially, what actually does? Because Todd's lease payment and someone else's decision to keep driving their old car aren't the same choice with different price tags. They're two completely different financial paths, and the gap between them is bigger than most people realize once you actually run the math. The real cost of financed lifestyle. Here's something that will probably annoy you a little, because it annoyed me when I first ran it. Two people can earn the exact same salary and end up nearly $70,000 apart in 3 years, without either of them doing anything that looks reckless. Remember Todd, the orthodontist with the Mercedes-Benz? Now meet his office manager, a woman named Colleen. Colleen makes a fraction of what Todd makes, but she's been driving the same 2021 Toyota Camry since she bought it used, paid it off 2 years ago, and hasn't touched it since. On paper, next to Todd's lease, her car looks almost embarrassing. No badge, no monthly flex to post about, nothing anyone would notice in a parking lot. Let's actually run the numbers, because this is where the story stops being about vibes and starts being about math. Todd's lease is $879 a month. Over 36 months, that's $31,644 spent. At the end of it, the car goes back to the dealership. He owns none of it. Not the seats, not the badge, not one bolt. Now imagine Colleen takes that same $879 a month, since her car is already paid off, and invests it instead, at an average annual return of 7%, which is a reasonable long-term estimate for a diversified stock portfolio. That monthly contribution grows to just over $35,000 after 3 years, not because she's a genius investor, just because the money was left alone to compound instead of being handed to a leasing company every month. So look at the actual gap. Todd spent $31,600 and has nothing to show for it. Colleen put in the same amount and has $35,000 growing, plus a car she still owns outright. That's not a small difference. That's close to a $70,000 swing in 3 years on identical monthly cash flow. And this is just one line item, one car decision. Multiply that same pattern across a mortgage, a credit card, a country club membership, and the gap doesn't stay in the tens of thousands for long. Here's what makes this sting a little more. Remember the median net worth for people in their late 40s and early 50s, sitting at around $246,000? That number already includes people like Todd, which means the households actually building wealth in that bracket are pulling the number up by a lot more than $246,000, while the Todds of the world are quietly pulling it back down. The lease, the bigger house, the club membership, they're not just spending. They're actively working against the one financial advantage this age bracket is supposed to have, which is decades of compounding still left on the table. I want to be fair to Todd here, because I don't think he's careless. I think he's responding to signals that feel completely normal. A $340,000 income does come with real pressure to look a certain way, to certain people, in a certain neighborhood. That pressure is real, but real doesn't mean free. Every dollar that goes toward looking the part is a dollar that stops compounding, permanently, the moment it's spent. So here's the question worth asking about your own life. Not, am I keeping up? A better one. Which of my monthly payments are building something, and which ones are just going back to a dealership, a bank, or a rental company at the end of the lease? Because the people who are actually ahead financially, the ones with real durable money, tend to look almost nothing like what you'd expect. And once you see how they actually live, the whole picture starts to flip. What actual wealth looks like. Here's a scene that never makes it onto anyone's feed. And honestly, that's exactly the point. A man named Walter lives in Port Royal, a neighborhood in Naples, Florida, on a piece of waterfront property currently worth somewhere around $9 million. He drives a Toyota Camry that's pushing 10 years old. His watch is a Timex, the kind you can buy for around $50 at a Target. Walter used to run a mid-sized manufacturing company, sold it a while back, and now he mostly fishes. If you passed Walter at a gas station, you would not look twice. Nothing about him signals $9 million. And that's not an accident. That's actually how most real wealth in this country behaves. Here's the mechanism worth understanding. Genuine net worth is overwhelmingly illiquid, meaning it's tied up in things that don't photograph well and were never designed to be shown off. Home equity, retirement accounts, ownership stakes in a business, none of that shows up as a car in a driveway or a bag on an arm. It shows up decades later, quietly, as the ability to stop working whenever you decide to. Think about how a 401k actually functions. Money goes in, and by design, you're not supposed to touch it or flaunt it for 30 or 40 years. There's no version of an IRA balance you can post a photo of that would impress anyone. It just sits there, compounding, invisible, doing the one job that actually matters. And I think that invisibility is exactly why so many people underestimate how many boring people around them are quietly loaded. Compare Walter to Todd from the last section, the orthodontist with the leased Mercedes-Benz and the house in Myers Park. Todd's wealth, such as it is loud. It's parked in his driveway. Walter's wealth is nearly silent, sitting in a brokerage account and a piece of land he's owned for 25 years. If you only had Instagram to go on, you'd guess Todd was richer. You'd be wrong, and not by a small margin. There's also something else going on with people like Walter, and it's worth naming honestly. A lot of quiet wealth stays quiet on purpose. Flaunting significant assets tends to invite exactly the kind of attention nobody actually wants. Lawsuits, scams targeting people who look like easy marks, family members suddenly needing help right around the time an inheritance becomes public knowledge. The wealthiest people I've come across tend to prioritize two things above almost everything else: growing what they have and being left alone. Neither one of those photographs particularly well. And I'll add one more piece here, because it matters, and it's easy to overlook. Some of what looks like impressive success is really just an invisible head start, passed down quietly through a family. Paying for the down payment or the tuition nobody ever mentions online. That's not a moral judgment. It's just another reason a stranger's highlight reel tells you almost nothing real about their financial position or about yours. So here's a genuinely useful mental shift, and it costs nothing to make. Every time you catch yourself comparing your life to somebody's feed, remember you're comparing your actual bank statement to their marketing material. Those were never the same category of thing to begin with. Once that clicks, something interesting happens. The anxiety doesn't disappear completely, because we're human, and comparison is wired in pretty deep. But it does loosen its grip, because you're no longer measuring yourself against a rigged scoreboard. You're finally looking at the right numbers, which raises the last, most useful question of all. If the scoreboard everyone's been checking was broken the whole time, what should you actually be measuring instead? How to measure your own progress. Here's a question worth asking yourself right now, before you keep scrolling through anything else today. If you couldn't see a single other person's life for the next year, no feeds, no comparisons, just your own numbers, would you actually feel behind? For most people, the honest answer is no. And that gap between how you'd feel in isolation and how you feel after 10 minutes of scrolling tells you almost everything about where the anxiety is actually coming from. It was never really about your numbers. It was about the scoreboard. So let's fix the scoreboard. Here's what actually deserves your attention instead. Start with your 401k match, because this one is close to free money, and most people leave it sitting on the table. If your employer matches contributions up to a certain percentage, and you're not contributing at least that much, you're walking past a raise you already qualify for. Before any lifestyle upgrade, before the next car, before the next renovation, That match should be fully claimed. A woman named Denise, an accounts manager in Columbus, Ohio, started doing exactly this 2 years ago. Nothing about her life looks different from the outside. Same house, same 10-year-old Subaru Outback in the driveway. But she's now capturing roughly $4,000 a year in employer match money that used to just evaporate. Next, know your actual net worth number, not your income number. Income is what you're paid. Net worth is what you'd actually have left if you added up everything you own and subtracted everything you owe. Most people can tell you their salary down to the dollar and have never once calculated the second number. That's backwards, because net worth is the one that actually determines your options later in life. Pull your accounts together once, write down the real total, and check it again every 6 months. It takes less time than scrolling through one evening of feed content. And here's the mental shift that ties the whole thing together. Before any purchase that's meant to be seen, the car, the bag, the renovation, ask one honest question. Is this building something, or is this just a photograph? A paid-off Camry and a leased GLE can sit in driveways right next to each other and look almost identical from the street. One of them is quietly becoming an asset. The other is quietly becoming a bill. Nobody driving by can tell the difference, and increasingly, that's exactly the point. None of this requires a dramatic overhaul of your life. It doesn't mean never buying anything nice again. And honestly, I'd be suspicious of anyone telling you that on the internet. It means being honest about which purchases are actually moving your numbers, and which ones are just moving other people's opinion of you. Because here's the real shift happening underneath all of this. Once you stop measuring your life against a highlight reel that was never accurate to begin with, and start measuring it against your own number, 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, the whole comparison trap starts to lose its grip. Not because you stopped caring about money, because you finally started keeping score with the right numbers. And that number, the one only you can see, the one that never shows up in anyone's feed, is the only one that was ever actually going to determine how your life turns out. The number that never makes the feed. So here's the actual takeaway, and it's simpler than it felt an hour ago. You were never behind. You were just watching the wrong scoreboard. The rented Lamborghini, the borrowed Birkin, the leased Mercedes with nothing behind it. None of that was ever proof of anything, except that someone paid for an appearance. Real wealth, the kind sitting quietly in a paid-off Camry, a fully funded 401k, a piece of waterfront land bought decades ago, doesn't perform for an audience. It was never built to. A few things worth holding on to. Income and net worth are not the same number, and only one of them determines your future. Lifestyle creep isn't weakness. It's a system nudging you gently towards spending every raise before it becomes savings. And the loudest version of wealth is usually the least real one. So the next time your feed makes you feel small, ask what you're actually comparing. Your real bank statement or someone else's marketing material. There's a related question worth sitting with next. If wealth is designed to be invisible, how do you tell who's actually teaching you something real, and who's just another version of the rented jet? I'd genuinely like to hear where you landed on this. Drop it in the comments.